Frank Lechner grew up in the Netherlands, which partly explains why he chose that country for this research. He graduated from Tilburg University there in 1978 and then pursued graduate study at the University of Pittsburgh, where he completed his 1985 sociology PhD 1 year later than Fink and Yanacone. He has never moved from his first job at Emory University in Atlanta since he started there after finishing his dissertation. To the extent that Lechner studies religion, it has been in the context of his wider theoretical interests in globalization, national identity, and social theory. Since the first religious marketplace literature began to appear in print, Lechner has been skeptical of the whole idea, questioning whether people's religious faith can be viewed as a commodity for which they can just switch from one brand to another. While some criticism of the religious marketplace literature explores evidence from within the United States to question whether religious conversion actually can be reduced to a simple shopping decision, this study, published 3 years after the Fink and Yanacone article, takes a comparative perspective. He wants to know in particular how this way of looking at people's faith holds up if we try to apply it to the country where he was born. A few years after sociologists and economists advanced the supply-side free market explanation for historical trends in religious activity, the reaction against this interpretation already began to emerge. Lechner wrote this article on secularization in the Netherlands as part of that developing debate. Although the quintessentially American argument that unregulated market competition among different religious groups started out as an abstraction from the special social context of the United States, the proponents of this way of thinking argued from the start that they were not just talking about one specific time in history or place in the world. They insisted that unregulated market competition amounts to a universal good thing, capable of improving people's life satisfaction in any society, in any age of the world, past, present, or future, and relating to any aspect of those lives. As such, Rodney Stark and Lawrence Yanacone followed up on the 1993 article by Fink and Yanacone with additional articles in the next couple of years that extended the supply-side doctrine around the world, including comparisons of European countries. If you have traveled in Europe and marveled at the countless magnificent cathedrals to be found across the continent, you may have noticed that if you go inside them, even on a Sunday morning, you mostly just see other tourists admiring the grand architecture. A worship service may be in progress, but often you will only see a few little old ladies scattered here and there in the pews. The supply-side scholars took aim at this riddle of the empty cathedrals, offering their explanation for this sharp contrast between architecture and attendance. Actually, Europe is even less homogeneous in religious or any other terms than is the case among different states in the United States. The old cathedrals are more empty in some countries than in others. People who study such patterns have noticed, for example, that church attendance turns out to be significantly higher in countries where the Roman Catholic Church is still the dominant religious institution in society. Places like Poland, Italy, and Ireland report the highest levels of attendance in Europe, while countries where Protestants have challenged Catholic hegemony and created a more diverse religious scene tend to have much lower levels of church attendance. This pattern already seems to argue against the supply-side argument for religious competition, since attendance is highest in countries where the Catholic Church faces the least competition. But overall, the level of church attendance is lower across Europe than we observe in the United States. Stark and Yanacone argued in their 1994 and 1995 articles that despite the religious pluralism introduced by Protestant competition with Catholics, the government in countries like the Netherlands still interferes too much and over-regulates religious life compared to the situation in the United States. And that is why the Dutch cathedrals look empty when you visit them, even on Sunday mornings. Now, as a matter of fact, we also find considerable variation in church attendance if we compare different states within the United States. The highest levels of church attendance appear in the southern region of the country, even higher in many cases than the church attendance found in Catholic European countries like Poland, Italy, or Ireland. On the other hand, states in New England and the Pacific Northwest tend to go to church much less. Their attendance is actually quite similar to the levels observed in places like the Netherlands. Some scholars have noticed that these regional attendance variations correlate strongly with the share of Black Americans in the total population, a point to which we'll return later as a separate topic. But in the end, it is true that church attendance tends to be higher across the United States than observed in European countries. The free market explanation for this difference should be familiar, since Fink and Yannicone developed these ideas in detail. Their theory is called a supply-side explanation because they reject the other possibility that people don't go to church simply because they don't feel any need for religion in the first place. Instead, Fink and Yannicone and their colleagues start from an assumption that there really is a universal need for religion in some sense. They usually define and measure this as individuals reporting that they believe in God or that religion is subjectively important in their lives. These personal reports of religiosity amount to what they assume to be a fairly constant high demand in all human societies for some kind of religious life. If this is true, and if all peoples everywhere feel a need for religion, then the only explanation for low levels of involvement must be that something is interfering with or blocking the satisfaction of that felt need. The supply-side theorists believe that this something comes from government regulation and interference with the ability of religious entrepreneurs to deliver religious services to people through open competition in the religious marketplace. If only the government would get out of the way, those Dutch cathedrals could all be filled up with worshipers in no time. Government regulation has made the Dutch church leaders lazy, and they can't be bothered to get serious about really selling religion to the Dutch people. But if a whole raft of competing religious entrepreneurs could be turned loose in this situation, they would soon take care of that little problem. Lechner takes a closer look at the situation in the Netherlands, though, and decides that his whole way of looking at things simply will not fit the facts. On the basis of his evidence, he rejects the supply-side argument. The deregulation answer for how to get Dutch people back in church has the virtue of being simple to understand and plausible as an idea, especially for people in the United States who've been brought up to worship the concept of free market competition as an almost religious ideal. Any government favoritism in the field of religion amounts to regulatory interference in the religious marketplace, so it is inherently a bad thing. European countries, after centuries of close interaction between secular governments and a practically universal Roman Catholic Church, developed a vast web of government connections to religion. These connections did not just evaporate when Protestantism came on the scene and began to compete with the Catholic Church in the European marketplace for religion. To this day, across much of Europe, the national governments take a hand in religion. For example, somebody has to put up the vast sums of money needed for maintenance on all those magnificent old cathedrals. They don't take care of themselves, and somebody has to pay the repair bills. In many countries, including the Netherlands, the government regulates the finances of religious groups by having people register as members of a particular religion, including both Protestant and Catholic groups. The lion's share of these groups' financial budget is collected for them by the government. You can fill out a form with your employer so that the government deducts your religious contributions directly from your paycheck, and then the government sends that money to your religious group to make sure there's no financial funny business going on. With all this government help, whether there is only one religion allowed or perhaps several different groups all feeding at the public trough, the supply-side theorists argue that such government support makes religious leaders lazy and complacent. They can sit back and wait for the government transfers to come in, so they don't worry too much about bothering their members about it. The result, according to this argument, is declining church attendance. As Lechner puts it, as the government gets more involved in religion, the people get less involved. Lechner does not examine this idea by comparing Europe to the United States. He does not even compare different European countries to each other. Instead, he looks only inside the Netherlands, but he considers how the situation in that country has been changing over time. According to the supply side explanation, if government regulation of religion increases over time, then religious involvement should decline over that same time period. On the other hand, if the government allows more competition in the religious marketplace, this should give religious entrepreneurs a chance to join the celebration and to offer alternatives to the lazy state church or churches. Such deregulation should energize the people who supply religion. That is, the people who knock on doors, hand out literature in train stations, advertise on wall posters and on television and on the internet. The religious entrepreneurs, in their turn, should energize the Dutch population and get them more interested again in religious ideas and activities. The result, according to orthodox free market theory, should be more people attending church once the religious entrepreneurs enter the picture. All the government needs to do is get out of the way and let them do their thing, and the cathedrals could all fill up again on Sunday mornings. So Lechner has a simple task. First, he has to find out what has been happening in terms of establishment versus disestablishment of religion. Has the government gradually been getting out of the way and allowing religious competition, or has it gradually been clamping down and restricting the religious marketplace? Second, he has to find out what has been happening over time to religious activity, and specifically church attendance. But before we consider the evidence he assembles on these two sides of the balance to see whether they fit the supply side theory, we should remind ourselves of the sometimes forgotten assumption about human nature that provides the foundation for the whole supply side argument, the concept of religious demand. To fill up those Dutch cathedrals, you not only need a flock of convincing entrepreneurs driven by their religious fervor and the prospect of full offering plates on Sunday morning. You also need a population that demands their services. People have to need religion. If we assume that this is just human nature, then we get a fairly constant natural wellspring of religious demand. If religious activity declines, we can't explain any such variations in terms of demand because you can't explain a variable with a constant. But as Lechner finds when he looks at the Dutch evidence, this steady-state assumption about an innate demand for religion may not be borne out by observed facts. If we measure such demand by how people respond to a question like, religion is very important in my life, or I believe that there will be an afterlife after I die, or Jesus died to take away my sins, Lechner finds that over the last few decades, more and more believers have given up on things once part and parcel of the subjective faith of Dutch Christians. He decides that claims about a large potential demand for more religion in their lives do not find ample support in the available data. So what might happen to the supply side theory if we have to abandon this unspoken assumption about a steady-state background of religious demand? To understand Lechner's conclusions, we will return to the basic comparison or question that he posed for his research. What has been happening over time, he asked, with respect to deregulation of the religious marketplace in the Netherlands? Has the government been clamping down and imposing additional restrictions on the activities of groups that want to supply religious services to people? Or has it been relaxing its grip and allowing more competition in that religious marketplace? To Lechner, the evidence that he examined seems clear and consistent. Over recent decades, he judges, more religious pluralism and competition has appeared in that Dutch religious marketplace. For one thing, he notes the steady increase in the number and variety of outside religious entrepreneurs who have been coming to try their luck in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and the Netherlands in general. Particularly from the fountainhead of religious competition in the United States, a stream of missionaries from Mormon, Baptist, and other congregations have been coming to the Netherlands with their Bibles and other literature in hand, witnessing on the sidewalks and inviting people to their activities. Facing budget woes of its own, the government in the Netherlands has listened sympathetically to suggestions that churches should be more responsible for keeping their own financial houses in order and depending less on money from the state. If any direction in government regulation of religion is apparent in recent decades of history in the country, this trend has been in the direction of disestablishment, deregulation, less state support, and increased autonomy and competition among different religious groups. Reinforcing this trend toward increased religious diversity, these same decades also have witnessed a significant influx of newcomers into the population of the Netherlands from former colonial territories in far-flung corners of the world. And these immigrants in many cases have brought with them some new and strange religions not much seen at all in the Netherlands in earlier times. The arrival of refugees from regions of tragic violence and conflict have even produced a new visibility for followers of Islam in Dutch cities and neighborhoods. No matter how we look at it, Lechner concludes, clearly we can see that the Dutch religious marketplace has become more open and competitive in many different ways over the past half-century or so. Returning to his basic research question then, Lechner asks how this increased diversity in the religious marketplace should have affected rates of Dutch church attendance. If the supply-side theory is correct, then this expansion of the competitive religious marketplace in recent decades should have produced a corresponding steady increase in rates of going to church. This might not translate into packed cathedrals, because after all, the cathedrals are still run by the official religious groups in the country. We're not going to find Islamic believers or Mormon converts in those cathedrals on Sunday mornings. But if we take sample surveys in the population and ask people how often they go to church, more people should start to report going to some kind of religious services more often in this climate of deregulation and increased competition. However, this is not at all what we find. Despite growing diversity in the Dutch religious landscape, the answers to such survey questions that Lechner assembled for the last half of the 20th century show a steady, dramatic decline in declared membership in churches. Questions about frequency of worship show a matching declining trend. When they should have been returning to church due to the energizing influence of additional new religious entrepreneurs active in the marketplace, the Dutch people have been drifting away from organized religions of all types at a steady rate, until by the 1990s such involvement was only half of what it had been in the 1950s. Given this contradiction between what we see in the Netherlands over time and what we would expect from the supply-side theory of religious involvement, it is hard to escape the conclusion that we probably need to go back and take another hard look at that underlying assumption that we can ignore trends in the innate need or demand for religion in the first place. Lechner already has shown us evidence that such subjective demand for religion apparently has been falling over time rather than holding constant as some kind of innate feature of human nature. If people simply don't seem to need religion as much as they once did, this by itself could easily explain why church attendance has been falling for half a century in the country. In fact, we might even be tempted to conclude that all this attention to regulation or deregulation of some kind of religious marketplace might actually be a complete waste of time, and that it doesn't really matter one way or the other what the government might or might not be up to. At least Lechner doesn't find much use for all that theorizing. But why has the demand, the felt need for religion, been falling? Why don't people say anymore that religion is important in their personal lives? Either there is no innate need for religion as part of basic human nature, or if there is, something else has come along and deflected that need in some other direction. What might that something else be? We also will return to this question as part of a later topic, but for now we might just take note of another quite clear pattern in the intensity of religious belief and activity. Whether you compare different countries in different parts of the world or different people within a single country, it always seems to turn out that the richer people get, the more they can afford advanced education and other luxuries of social life, the less intense they become about religion. The poorest, least educated countries are also the places where religion continues to energize people the most and where they get the most upset about religious arguments and controversies. In the Netherlands, one of the richest, most prosperous, most educated countries in Europe, and therefore in the world, people's felt need for organized religion has declined to such an extent that many of those fine old empty cathedrals actually being turned into fashionable restaurants today instead. This reminds me of a comment a friend once made to me about the difference between rural South Carolina, where we happened to be at the time, and the San Francisco Bay Area. Where we were, my friend observed, on Sunday morning people went to church. In San Francisco, on Sunday morning, people went to brunch.